through the wonderfulness of the Texas Public Information Act, Glenn Shankle, being suspicious that county officials may have been making trips to TCEQ to meet with them, requested sign-in sheets for the TCEQ campus in Austin. What came back were sign-in sheets that were rather interesting. This is an actual sign-in sheet here for September the 5th, and if you go down here to the bottom and you look right here, it says Ralph Marquez. Ralph Marquez is a former commissioner of the TCEQ, and he is now a lobbyist and one of the roughly 6 or 7 lobbyists that Green Group now has on their payroll. But right below that, Frank Pecluda from Waller County. This is the actual sign-in sheet. Ralph Marquez signed in at looks like roughly 2:30, signed out at 3:53. Frank Pecluda signed in just shortly after that at 2:38, and also signed out at the same time that Ralph Marquez left. The next sheet shows Glenn Beckendorf. And again, he signs in a minute after Frank, and they both leave, all of them leave at 3:53, and they're all going to meet with Brent Wade. Now, Brent Wade is the Deputy Director of the Office of Waste at TCEQ, and they met in his offices. That secret meeting, which nobody knew about, and which nobody to this day would know about had not Glenn Shankle filed that Public Information Act request to get those sign-in sheets, consisted of Ralph Marquez, Glenn Beckendorf, Frank Pecluda, Brent Wade, and I put a question mark in front of Earl Lott. Earl Lott is the Director of the Office of Waste Permits. Now, the reason I put a question mark there is I believe he may have been at that meeting because of things that he said later at one of the TCEQ public meetings that was held at the Hempstead High School. We don't know whether there were any other TCEQ officials at the meeting. But at the November 15th public meeting, I'm sure if y'all were there, you remember it with great affinity. Glenn Shankle got up and presented those sign-in sheets to the TCEQ officials there, and Earl Lott was one of them. And Glenn Shankle questioned Earl Lott on what was the subject of that meeting. Why were they there? Well, Earl Lott's response was simply that they wanted to know, meaning our county officials, whether the TCEQ viewed the landfill application or the 2011 Waller County Ordinance as having been in existence first, and to make a decision on whether Waller County would fight to enforce its ordinance. The interesting thing of it is that for a meeting that supposedly contains that subject matter, which is having to do with the legality, the law, the statutes of what comes first and so forth, our 2 county officials do not appear to have been accompanied by any legal counsel whatsoever. There is nothing on the sign-in sheets to show what anybody from Allison Bass or anybody from the district attorney's office or the county attorney's office is being at that meeting. So you have to ask yourself, why would our 2 county officials attend this meeting without any legal counsel to discuss that subject in a meeting with TCEQ officials and Green Group's lobbyists? Well, the interesting thing of it is that the morning of September 5th, before Frank and Glenn drove to Austin, there was a Commissioner's Court meeting. Now, during that Commissioner's Court meeting, there was a half-hour-long executive session. And it's not reflected who all was in that executive session meeting in the minutes, but if you look at the invoices from Allison Bass, you'll see that Jim Allison drove all the way from Austin to Waller County that morning to attend that executive session. It's in the invoices. So they spent a half hour talking with Jim Allison in executive session, and then after that's over, Mr. Pecluda and Mr. Beckendorf drive to Austin to have this important meeting with TCEQ officials without any legal representation whatsoever. So that leaves a lot of questions about what that meeting was. Why did they attend the meeting without any legal counsel? It makes no sense. At this point in time, Allison Bass had laid out a clear and compelling argument for the validity of the original ordinance, and done so very well. And just the day before sent a letter to TCEQ again asking them to deny the permits. So why weren't they at this meeting? Had Beckendorf and Pecluta already decided in favor of the landfill at that point? And you have to ask yourself, if they go to this meeting without their attorneys, then they probably did. But then what's the point of the meeting at all? Why would they drive all the way to Austin if they had already made up their minds and they're just telling TCEQ that we're not going to fight and defend our ordinance? Why would they drive up there? Just what was the purpose of that meeting? That remains the most mysterious day out of the entire going on 3 years of this battle. Now, interestingly, September the 5th, if you go through and you do a study of the invoices from Allison Bass, the invoices are very interesting. They're all itemized on what it was, how each section of time of every day of every lawyer, what they spent working on, and the subject of what they were working on in behalf of Waller County. And it's quite evident that September the 5th was basically the day when all members of Allison Bass quit fighting to defend the Waller County original 2011 ordinance and started working on things like host agreement negotiations, takings impact assessments, etc., etc. Now, all throughout September time period and going forward, there were many, many more secret meetings between Frank Pecluta and Green Group and between Judge Beckendorf and Green Group, and we assume that during this stage that they're negotiating the host agreement, but we don't really know. Now, during all this period of time, we have Allison Bass working for us, trying to defend the Waller County original ordinance. The public is uneasy about it because they don't see that the TCEQ is responding, but nonetheless, we have been assured and have been told by our elected officials that they're fighting to defend this ordinance. December the 19th, this was of 2012, was the day when we found out otherwise. There was a commissioner's court meeting that morning, and all of you who were there, I'm sure, remember it very well. This was the first time where they actually voted to publish in the newspaper a notice that's required of a public hearing for amending the ordinance. There were 3 items on the agenda that day. One was to litigate the current ordinance. The other was to place notices in the paper for amending the ordinance. And actually, I'm thinking of January the 2nd. In any event, Otis Stiers and Sylvia Cedillo were replaced by John Amsler and Jerron Barnett at the 1st of 2013. On the 2nd day of January, there was a commissioner's court meeting where Beckendorf, Kitzman, Pecluta, and Jerron Barnett all voted to publish that notice. Now, they had done so on December the 19th, which told us what they were going to do, 6 days before Christmas. I'm sure that everybody remembers that Christmas very well, but it wasn't until January the 2nd when they actually set a date for the public hearing, and that was to be on February the 12th at 6 p.m. It was also the first mention of the takings impact assessment at that time. Now, February the 12th, if you remember, we had a huge rally in Hempstead. More than 1,000 people showed up. We had many people speak at the public hearing, and I left a slide out, but I wanted to remind everybody that 2 things happened. On December, I believe it was December the 10th or the 14th or somewhere in that time frame, the TCEQ had finally come out and said that the application that Pintail had filed, all 4 parts, were finally technically complete, and they issued what's called a draft permit. That set into motion some things, because then Waller County had to make up its mind as to whether to file a lawsuit to defend the ordinance or whether to amend the ordinance. So So by the time this came around, between that period of time, between December 19th, the city of Hempstead had annexed some land. And now the extraterritorial jurisdiction for the city of Hempstead, part of the landfill site is within that extraterritorial jurisdiction. On February the 12th, and actually sometime beforehand, the city of Hempstead gave Waller County legal notice that they could not amend the ordinance to make that site the only site in Waller County where a landfill could be, because it was within their extraterritorial jurisdiction. Waller County had adequate legal notice of that going into the public meeting, at which Mayor Wolf spoke very eloquently and forcefully that if you amend the ordinance, the city of Hempstead will have no choice but to sue you. So on February the 13th, we had that rally, we had that hearing, Commissioner's Court the next morning. Sure enough, Judge Beckendorf and Commissioner Kitzman and Pokluda vote to pass an ordinance amending the original ordinance and to sign the host agreement. Now, at that point in time, they knew certain things. They knew, one, that if they wanted to defend their original ordinance, that they would have to take TCEQ to court and file a lawsuit. But they also knew that the city of Hempstead, if they amended the ordinance to make that the only site, that the city of Hempstead was going to sue them. And that was more likely to be a much longer, more expensive, longer drawn out lawsuit because of the complexities of it. And knowing that, they still voted to amend that ordinance. And then I'll end it on February the 15th. That was the day when Allison Bass sent letters to the TCEQ and the HGAC that rescinded all of the prior opposition that he had sent on behalf of the county. And so that brings us up to the point where the lawsuit started beginning.